everybody. Matt Heller here, founder of Performance Optimist Consulting and the author of The Myth of Employee Burnout. Here with another intriguing episode of Three Questions. This is where I get to ask three questions of a guest, they get to ask three questions of me, and we just see where the conversation goes. We have no idea what these questions are going to be when we start, so all of our answers are unrehearsed and unprepared. Today, I am super excited to welcome Larry Gorneault Jr. to the call. Larry and I go way back with NEAPA and IAPA and all kinds of APAs, and I am super excited to hear what his questions are going to be for me, and also, of course, what his answers are going to be to my questions. So Larry is the Director of Operations at Lake Compounds in Bristol, Connecticut. And Larry, without further ado, if you wouldn't mind just saying hello and tell us a little bit about what you do there.
Sure, absolutely. First off, thank you for having me on the show. Like Matt said, we go back many years now with different programs and things that we've done. I've been at the park now going on my 16th season at the facility. Started off as a team member like most people probably have in a seasonal park, trying out for that seasonal job. Didn't know what it was really, and then loved it so much that I kept applying for the opportunity for growth. Moved into seasonal management a few years after starting, and then the rest goes that I pretty much just made a full-time manager out of me and loved it again. And then I got to my current role about 10 or 15 years later. So now I'm the Director of Operations, so I oversee the ride attractions, water park, our admissions guest relations area, games retail, and then our special events departments ultimately funnel up to me, which would be our Halloween and Christmas setup and event now at this point in time.
Awesome.
So that's kind of where we're at now, yeah.
Okay, very cool. Very cool. Do you want to ask the first question, or do you want me to?
No, I can go ahead and get going. The way that I kind of structured my questions was kind of, I think, a process of time spent over the course of a couple of years. So each one kind of builds upon each other, I think. Okay. So without further ado, the first one I want to start with is one that's near and dear to my heart. Is really, I think it all starts with the frontline employees for success, at least for an amusement park and hospitality. And we're in the process right now of hiring our staff and selecting them from amongst all the applications we receive, and competing, of course, against our local, McDonald's and everything else that's also hiring staff as well. So my question goes to you. In your experiences now with, doing the consulting, you've been in hospitality, you've done all sorts of different things. And, when you're writing your books, I'm sure you've done a lot of interviews with different companies. Have you found a process yet, or one that you think would be a really good suggestion that we could use to try to narrow down that entry-level team member to find out exactly what makes them tick, to see if they're properly aligned with our value system right off the get-go, so that way we can skip through, if possible, some of the training that we have to do to try to get that perfect team member that really buys in? It's kind of a loaded question, I think. But
no, but it's a great one, and I want to start with your values. Because one of the first things I started off when we're asking about hiring is, really understanding what your values are and what those look like behaviorally, right. What those mean to a frontline, 16 or 17-year-old, what that looks like to a guest. Because if you don't have those, whatever process you're using is you're kind of, what's the expression? Shooting fish in a barrel or whatever. It's kind of haphazard, right? So I think the important part of the process has to be that whatever process you're using has to be based on your values, and you really have to use that as a core. So it sounds like you're already doing that, which is awesome and fantastic. And you're right. The idea is that if you get people that are already aligned with those values, you will get them to, do the things that you may have had to potentially train other people to do, right? If it's respect and teamwork and guest service, and you find people that are just naturally compelled to do those things, it makes the rest of it a lot easier. Right. So I think that's a big part of it. And then, putting them in situations, and I know this can be really tough from a seasonal business because you've got so many people that you need to whittle down into, the staff that you're actually going to have. Right. But getting them into situations where you can actually see how they're going to act and see how they're going to react to other things, rather than just sitting them down. You know how it is. What's your greatest weakness? What's your greatest strength? Because people can prepare for those kind of interviews, but it's a lot harder to prepare for an interview where they're going to be brought in and put in front of some people and say, these folks are complaining about, their child getting on a ride. What are you going to do?
Right.
And just see what they do, and they may just fold under the pressure, or they may completely blossom, and that will give you an idea of what that person's going to do when they're out in the field. So I don't know. Do you guys do any kind of group interviews? Do you do those kind of things to put them in those situations?
Actually, we do. We started years back. We came up with what I called was a recruiting team, and essentially it was a collection of seasonal supervisors that were from different departments, and they were collectively trying to select the best candidate that would fit for the park. Mm-hmm. So they were hiring for the park, and then based upon personality, they got fitted into the appropriate department that reflected their skills. So moving forward to what we're doing now, we now do it individually, department by department, doing a group interviewed style, and we actually are in the process of casting our staff at this point in time, similar to what you said. So I'm happy that you think that that's probably a good way to go. Is we usually come up with like 3 scenarios, and we say you're actors on our stage right now. Mm-hmm. So here they are. You don't know what we're going to tell you. We want to see what you respond to, and then we use it as what we call training. So at the end of the casting exercise, we actually go over the strengths of the performance, some of the things that they probably wouldn't know, the details. So that way, if they do get hired, when they move to the next training, they've already been exposed to some of the top problems that they're probably going to encounter throughout the course of their year here. And that's different for every department, the questions that they ask or the scenarios, but they're usually the 3 top most problems that we've seen staff struggle with throughout the course of the year.
And do you see that by going through that, there's people that will opt out and say, you know what, if this is really what it's going to be like, this is not for me?
Absolutely, we do. And then there's a component of it at the end where we do a one-on-one. That's where we kind of reflect upon the entire group, because some people we find don't respond well in the group. They're not confident in their answers. And at 16, I remember myself at 16. Now I have no problem speaking in public or standing in front of a group of people. But when I was 16, I was shy. I was timid. And it took me years of the training that I was provided to kind of get out of the shell and develop the character, as I like to call it, that I now have when I'm speaking in front of the public. So we do have a component of that. And then there are a couple of departments we don't do the actual group interview, like our perk services department, a little bit more challenging to find a good recruit for that area. So we usually do the one-on-one. And even our admissions teams, we like to have that more personal touch because they're the entry to the park. So we usually have one-on-ones with them too.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I think the values piece, getting them to actually do something, and even giving them the opportunity to show who they are, and like you said, it's a great point that some people may have it in them. We just need to find it and pull it out.
Right.
So
right.
that's I think building that into the process is key.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good. Excellent. So are you ready for a question from me?
Absolutely. Sure.
All right. So we are connected on LinkedIn.
Correct.
And I don't know if you know this, but we have 124 connections in common.
Oh, I did not know that. Oh.
I didn't know that until I looked this morning. So anyway, but my question is about networking, because that's such an important part of, especially when you move up in a role and move up into parks and things like that. And, you're involved in the industry outside of lake compounds as well. So I'd love to hear sort of what your tips are for networking. How do you build your network?
Right.
And how important do you think that is to your development as a professional?
That's a really good question. We stress when we're doing our recruiting for supervisors, we go through their resume, and we actually do resume building with that person. One of the things that you can't evaluate on a resume is the network that they've built. So that's one of the other things that we kind of tie into our resume building experiences is what type of network are you developing here while working here? So to answer your question, I think it's one of the most important things you can do. And coming from what I said a moment ago, it's a challenge sometimes for me to go up to somebody I don't know normally and introduce myself. But if I'm in a group setting, I usually get more comfortable or sitting in a classroom like Ames or IAPA, where I'm listening to everybody else suggest what they're doing. And when I hear something I've encountered, that instantly gives me a reason to go over to talk to that person. I feel more comfortable. but I find it to be extremely valuable to build a network because usually I find that in the summer, every year, even though you can quote unquote say sometimes it's on autopilot, it's the same process that you follow. There's always that time where I come up with a situation I've never dealt with before,
Mm-hmm.
especially in my current role where I've taken on additional responsibilities and different departments. I'm seeing things for the first time from a different scope. I'm like, man, how would you handle this in a different facility? So building that network that I've built down at Ames and sitting in these classes and talking to managers and directors and entry level team members and interns, I'm listening to how they would respond to certain questions I've answered. It's actually allowed me to get to that answer so much quicker for our guests at our facility. So some of the tools I've used, like you mentioned, is LinkedIn. And LinkedIn, I have gotten a lot of feedback over the years. Now, profile, I'm still evolving the profile, but the network that you mentioned, the 120 so connections that we have, I get a response every time I post an article. Somebody will usually friend me, and I'll start talking to them through the instant message portion and just asking a little bit about them. And then they ask me a couple of questions similar to what we're doing now, just not on camera. And I find that again, just allows me to reach out to them when I have a problem, and it just helps me get to the answer much quicker. So I think it's extremely important. So at that entry level position, 16, 18-year-old, or for our facility specifically, I can't stress it enough that the people you're meeting today could eventually be somebody that's hiring you tomorrow. And if you develop that relationship now, it's only going to help you when you actually sit down in front of them and actually interview for that role.
Right, right. And I'm glad you mentioned, that it can be difficult to actually, start the relationship or start the conversation, especially, you're at an Ames or a WWA or an IAPA or something,
Right.
and you feel alone, and you don't know anybody potentially, or it's great to just kind of tag onto one person, so at least you have somebody that but that can be very, very scary. But I think the outcome or the benefit of it it's like ripping the Band-Aid off. You just got to do it, right?
Absolutely.
And you've got to find what works for you in order to build the network so that you have those resources to go to. And I'd love to hear too, because you said there's situations that come up that you may not be able to know how to deal with just yet. Have you found that other people have gone through similar things to you?
Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. No. I'll give you an example. Last year, we were putting in our first roller coaster that we put in about 17 years at the Fartphobia. You probably heard or read a little bit about it.
Yep.
I actually got, as we were developing the ride, and our general manager was placing it and doing all the stuff he has to do to get that attraction up and running. I actually, through LinkedIn, received a message from one of my friends, Charlie, who's at Six Flags. He was at a Six Flags park. And he actually was involved with the install and creating the operations guidelines for his ride operators for their version of it through Tempesto. So he ended up connecting with me, and he started talking to me about some of the common things that they've seen, some of the mechanical aspects that we might want to watch out for. He was raving about the ride itself, saying it was an amazing attraction, and the guest feedback was positive. So we went back and forth a few times, and he just kept walking me through, like, this is how we have it staffed. This is where our operators stand. These are some of the ways that we check the restraints, in addition to what the manual says as an extra safety precaution. So I found that extremely beneficial because looking at a roller coaster for the first time, I know what I would do, but there's some things I don't know because I've never done it before when it comes to this type of ride that he actually provided me with the insight to. So it was extremely valuable for me to connect with him on that one item as an example.
No, and that's a great example of how that actually wasn't just a relationship that was nice to have. It actually helped you.
Oh,
right?
Yes, absolutely. And I was able to teach our rides manager, who that was his first year in his role because I had moved up. I was teaching him the process of how I go about creating these manuals and creating the operating guidelines and staffing. And I was using some of what I had learned from the conversation with my friend from Six Flags. So it actually worked out in my benefit when it came to that particular ride.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that.
I met him at Ames too, which is where it all started. So.
Right? Yeah. Awesome. Do you have another question for me? I think I'm ready.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, obviously once you get hopefully what you would assume to be the right team members or group of team members in, the next step after onboarding or could be a part of onboarding is training. So when it comes to training, every park I'm sure does it differently. Some people, for water parks, use Ellis to help them out, or when pigs fly, and all those different types of programs. Now, outside the amusement industry, you've gained some experiences about how they've hired people, usually full-time roles, I would assume.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you have seen in the outside world that was a good best practice that, if implemented correctly in a seasonal facility like mine, could help get the team members to be superstars in a relatively quicker manner? Because as you know, the average turnovers in 6 months at a full-time career or less, and you're spending a lot of money in training. And for us, we have 2 weeks to make these kids experts for the entire season. So it's a lot more of a learning curve. So have you found any tips or tricks to kind of get through that process in that 2 weeks based upon your experiences outside of potentially the hospitality industry?
Sure. And I'll go to that 2 weeks as first of our roadblock, but also our opportunity, because
Right.
In that time there's a lot of information that people need to have, right? And there's sometimes a tendency to overload people
Yes.
with that information, right?
Yes.
So one thing that I've found that some parks are actually starting to adopt is to not try to focus all that energy on that 2 weeks, right?
Yeah.
So you spread out what you're doing. So instead of saying, hey, we have to give them everything that they need in 2 weeks, we're going to give them the basics of what they need to operate in the first week. And then we're going to let that sink in, a little bit. And then we're going to take some of those resources that we would have spent in those first 2 weeks, and we're going to put it in the week 3 and 4, right?
I see.
And so they're spreading it out kind of over the season, and it does a couple of things. Number one, it allows people to really absorb all that stuff that you're trying to teach them. Especially let's just take rides and safety, right? You want safety to be number one, right?
Yes.
You want them to be, following all the procedures, doing everything that they should be doing from a safety standpoint. So great. So we'll start there, and then maybe a week or two in, then you bring in some of the hospitality. Once they're comfortable with that, now let's get you saying hello. Now let's get you asking questions, where you're from, that kind of thing. But it kind of builds on those skills that they've already got. And then you can even take it, further down the road. Now let's go service recovery. How do you deal with someone that's upset? Now that you've got, a couple of weeks on the job, you've seen some of the people that have been upset.
Yeah.
Now let's put that into practice. So it's really about kind of spreading that process, not thinking you have to get everything done in the first 2 weeks, but spreading it out a little further.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that does is that it gives people something to look forward to. So as a frontline employee, and really this is human nature, we all want to be moving forward. We all want something to be looking forward to. So if that frontline person knows that, hey, this week I did safety, next week we're doing hospitality, the next week we're doing service recovery, and then after that we're going to do hospitality 201, and we go to the next level, or I get to shadow somebody in another department, whatever it is. Now they have an actual kind of like in school, you have a learning plan, right? And now that's going to take more time to put together, but then you've got an opportunity to do things over the course of time and let people build on that knowledge and build on the skills.
I see. So they're essentially taking the labor budget or what they have already applied, and they kind of spread it out a little bit. So you're still using the same amount of time. You're not adding additional resources in that particular kind. Correct. It's an interesting way of looking at that, because I remember a couple of years ago, I took, when I was in rides, I said, wow, they learn way too much in a single day. Because at the time, it was 1 day of training, you get your certification, your testing, and then depending on your performance, you learn more attractions throughout the course of the year. Sure. And we split it down into 2 days. Same amount of time, just in 2 day intervals. First day was, introductions, where you stand, this is the numbers, yada, yada, tour. And then the second day was the specifics for rides. And that seemed to help us with the saturation. So applying that same principle across the board to what you just mentioned, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. So,
yeah, and you and I both came up through seasonal parks where that was the tradition, right? You give them everything in the beginning of the season, so it's a little bit of a shift in people's mindsets.
Right.
I'll also share with you one of the water parks that I work with. They use Ellis, to help them with their lifeguard training, and by Ellis guidelines, you have to do an in-service. I think it's every 2 weeks,
Right.
right?
Right.
So they said, well, if we can make time to do that, every 2 weeks, why can't we make time to do a guest service class every 2 weeks?
I see.
Same idea, right? It's just that Ellis had been saying you have to do this. Nobody else had been saying you have to do a guest service class. So now it was just something that they changed their thought process and said, oh, well, if we just say we have to do it and we just make it happen, we can. We can do anything we want and we set our mind to.
Right.
It's just whether or not we're going to put the things in place to make it happen.
That's an interesting way of looking at it too, is comparing that with Ellis. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it doing it that way, and I think it's an interesting idea.
Yeah. So awesome. I love thinking about that kind of stuff. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, no problem.
So I have another one for you.
Sure.
And this is one that I've gotten from a couple of people recently. But just thinking back on your career, you've worked with a lot of people. You've worked with a lot of managers. You've worked with a lot of people that have probably, tried to show you the ropes and things like that. And I'm just curious if there's been one piece of advice that you've gotten from somebody, a mentor, a manager, whoever, could be a parent, whoever, that has really stuck with you, that's helped you grow into the person that you are.
It's kind of funny. The answer to that question actually leads into my question for you.
Okay.
So it's kind of funny that you bring that up. I've had multiple people in my life that have, I call them snapshots, that have provided me with a snapshot or a glimpse of a picture that helped me put together the puzzle in my head to help create what I wanted to envision myself becoming.
Awesome.
So there's a million of those people, but the ones that really stand out the most, or the one thing that I would talk about now without going into 4 hours of lecture, is my father said to me when I was a kid, he started talking to me about the principles of learning and about drive and all the stuff I'm sure most people hear from their parents. Well, both my mother and my father kept pushing to me was to learn something new all the time. Don't ever settle for knowing enough, because that's when you get complacent. It's when you get lazy. Get up at 6 a.m. Go do what you got to do.
Mm-hmm.
So what that led me to, as I started to grow into adulthood and climb the ranks of where I'm at now, is the acronym FAIL kind of started to stick out to me. Most people look at words and they come up with a positive or negative feeling towards them. I try to look at them from a third perspective of making sure that everything I'm trying to approach is positive. So when I hear people saying that they're failing at something, they give up, or they fail at this and they don't want to do anymore, I look at that as an opportunity for change. So fail to me, it just really simply means it's your first attempt in learning.
Okay.
That's what it kind of stands for in my head. So when I apply that to everything I'm doing, it kind of takes away a little bit of the pressure of being perfect from the get-go. That racehorse wasn't able to win every single time off the first time they ran around the track. Some trainer had to work with them and develop them and make them faster, change the diet, do what they had to do. And it's the same thing with me. So when I started to apply that acronym FAIL to my life, it took the pressure off and allowed me to keep growing as an individual, because if I didn't get to where I wanted to go the first attempt, I'm going to learn from that opportunity and grow from it for the next time to make it even better. And I've applied that to every training program I've developed or hiring practice, and it's allowed my creativity to foster, and it leads into other things like Halloween. I mean, there's a million things I can apply it to, but that one central theme has been one of the driving forces of me since I was probably 18 and really started to figure out what I wanted to do in life was learn more and don't be afraid to fail, both literally and be the first attempt in learning at that particular juncture.
That's awesome. That is awesome. And I think it's so important for leaders, for frontline employees, for anybody to know that it's okay to not succeed because you can learn from it, right?
Absolutely.
And you can grow from it. In fact, that's the only way we do grow.
Right.
If we stay in our comfort zone, we're never going to get better at anything.
Right.
So I like that.
It's like a muscle, whether you work out or you don't. I think it's applicable to anyone. Is if you keep doing the same routine over and over again, you get complacent. It doesn't grow. You have to tear the fibers, and you have to rebuild them, and you have to add more weight. It's the same thing in life. You have to keep throwing new challenges you've never done before to keep growing the brain so that the brain continues to adapt and you can keep growing as an individual. But you have to be driven to do that. So that's how that has applied to me in life. So.
And do you try to instill that in folks? And does it always take? Like, do they buy into this?
Well, without see how I can answer that. In my current role, it's become a little bit more easier in one sense because I'm able to influence more. I have more of the ability to sit down with the leadership team that directly reports to me and really start preaching this, but also showing them how it works, going back to things like their resume, showing them how to build that based upon their first attempt of submitting it versus what we show them is the end of how it should look and teaching them the process. I don't believe in training a supervisor to be a robot, which I know sometimes some people like to do that. I try to teach you the thought processes that you need, not only that are applicable in our company, but also in life. So I want you to make a decision, and I'm not going to tell you if it's right unless you're going so far off track that it could be extremely counterproductive, because I want you to see if it works or doesn't work, and then we're going to talk about the process that you use to get there. So I want them to apply the concept of fail. So I do this all the time now with our leadership, and it's actually creating depth. It takes time. It takes about 2 years to develop depth or change a program, at least in my experience. So since I've tried this, I have seen our retention and supervisors slowly increase because now they're buying in a little more because we're developing them. They appreciate that a little more.
And so when you say depth, you mean like the depth of the supervisors that you have and the strength of kind of your bench strength. Is that kind of what you're talking about with depth?
Yeah. Because one thing I know we've struggled in some of our areas was if the manager moves on to another opportunity, we first look at the seasonal leadership for a possible promotion. And in some instances, there's nobody there that we felt comfortable with, so we had to seek outside. So I try to view it as don't be afraid of the person beneath you knowing more than you. Train them to know as much as you, if not more. So if you get the opportunity to grow, that person grows with you, and you keep creating that depth. So on your day off, I'm not calling you saying, hey, where's this, where's that? That supervisor knows exactly what to do, and that's through not training them to be robotic and do what I tell you. It's make sure you understand why this is important so you can make the decision and tell me what you did.
Right.
So
right.
That's where I'm going with it.
And someday you're going to probably move on, move
right.
up, and so you're going to want to have somebody qualified to be able to take your spot.
Absolutely.
And I know some people just have a real fear. You talked about not teaching your supervisors too much. Some people have a fear of that because they think they're going to take their position. But
yes,
if they don't, then you're stuck. Right?
Absolutely.
So it's kind of counterproductive.
Yeah, I think some people are insecure about that. They've earned it and they're afraid to lose it. But really, if you share with them, and this is just my approach, I feel collaboration will only lead to success. And if you sit down, 10 heads are better than one. If I have one idea, I can listen to 10 different viewpoints on it and come up with the best solution. And then at the end of the day, I'll make the decision. But at least now I have another perspective. Okay. So I really feel that type of training, in my opinion, is the better way to go since I've started doing it.
Okay. Awesome. And you said that kind of led into your next question for me.
It does. So essentially, you've transitioned obviously out of hospitality and to a certain degree, a fixed park or, into doing what you're doing now. And you're also an author on top of that. So you had to become an entrepreneur to a certain degree in different senses. So you had to develop a different set of skills that you maybe not necessarily didn't have before, but you didn't realize you needed to the level you do today. So my question is there a process that you now use that you find that has worked best for you to create the level of success that you currently are achieving? And is that something that we can learn from you to apply and teach our staff now? Is it the concept of failing and you learn from your mistakes? Is there a whole nother set of processes that you've developed that you're like, wow, if I had known this 10 years ago, 5 years ago, man, I would be right here, right there. Is there something that can be learned from your jump around of all these different industries you're involved in now?
Well, I will tell you that there's something that I've learned about myself that I think if people learn about themselves, then it kind of catapults you to being able to be even more successful. Right. And that is not something I learned until probably the last few years. And it was really having confidence in what I was doing. and what I mean by that is I can, somebody can call and say, we want you to put together a program, come to do something for us, and what I've found is that I'm the type of person that if I'm going to come do a program, look, if I came back up to Lake Compounds and did something, I'm going to rehearse it at home.
Right.
And I'm going to try to make it the best I can, in my living room, so to speak. And then when I come up to the park, then I know where things are going. I know how the program's going to flow and that kind of thing. But what I've found is that I've gotten more confident in my ability to lead those type of sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I'm perfect at it, but I'm better than I used to be. But that I know that I can put something out there and I can be confident that I know where I'm going to be able to take it, if that makes sense. So
no, I am. Yeah.
and you do a lot of training. So when you are in front of a group and you can throw something out there and really get it to almost any place that you want it to go. If you want to make a point about X, you can tell a story that you've told, before, and you can kind of apply it to different tactics, if you will. So right. I think it's just my confidence to say, I can do this, and that allows me to pursue more things. And when people call and say, hey, can you do this thing that you've never done before?
Right.
Like, well, I think I can, and so that allows me to say yes to things that maybe I wouldn't have said yes to 5 years ago. So wow. That's kind of a roundabout way of saying I've built the confidence in what I can do in myself to know that I can take a leap and I'll be okay. So it's kind of like your fail thing, right?
Right.
So if you're confident enough in knowing that, first of all, that failure isn't permanent, failure isn't fatal, right. That you're going to be able to spin things into a success in some way, then, I mean, the sky's the limit at that point.
Jeez. And that's something that you discovered over the past few years, you said.
Definitely. Yeah.
That was when you probably transitioned out of a 9-to-5 quote unquote job to a entrepreneurial opportunity. That's when that kind of came about.
I think that's when I realized that was happening because, now, like you say, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm on my own, right? There's nobody else that's saying, yeah. Here's how you run your business. I can go online and I can Google things and I can look to the experts who are already doing it and get some clues and ideas and learn things that way. But there's very few people that are doing it the way I'm doing it, specifically for the attractions world, and that type of thing. Like you mentioned when pigs fly, Patty and Cindy, they're doing it. They've got a specific core of what they do, very much in safety and ride training and audits and that kind of thing. And they're great at what they do. My focus is a little different. So I've got to figure out how that works with different organizations and the industry as a whole. And, what other things I can provide to the industry. How else can I help people? If I'm, reaching a certain number of people by going to the parks, that's fantastic. But, maybe there's other people that are not involved with that need the help. And,
right.
My tagline is helping leaders lead. So how can I get into those little crevices and nooks and crannies all over the industry and give them the opportunity for some resources that maybe they wouldn't have had before. So that all comes back to the confidence that I've kind of gained over the last couple of years.
Now, with that confidence, it's kind of a follow-up question to that. Is there a process that you use now when you said you're talking about practicing like in your living room?
Mm-hmm.
And I know for me, when I was 18 and I was told, hey, you're a supervisor of so-and-so section. Here's your morning meeting, go to town. And I've never spoken my entire life. And at the time, I actually was petrified of public speaking, but I forced myself to do it. So is there any tricks that you can possibly share with us that you use? Because, I've seen you speak a few times. You do a great job speaking. You get everybody engaged. And there's some things that I've learned from watching your presentations, and you've actually provided me with some feedback in IAPA a couple of years back, if you recall, mm-hmm. that I've applied to what we do now. So is there anything that you can share with us that would be, like your tips of how to prepare for a presentation and gain maybe that confidence to a certain degree with the presentational side?
Sure. Practice is number one for me. And it's what you practice too that I think is important, right? So if you have a section of content, maybe you're talking about feedback and you're going to do a session with your supervisors about feedback, and you know that section, you know the feedback model you're going to be talking about, but what you don't know is how you're going to transition that into something else, into the next topic.
Yeah.
So I really try to practice the transitions as much as anything, right? So I know how I'm going to go from feedback to whatever the next topic is, and then whatever the next topic is. I've also found it is part of that process. And speaking of training specifically, is that in terms of the audience, you're better off covering fewer topics but going deeper into those topics than you are by trying to cover 1,000 topics and just scratching the surface.
Right.
So that gives you an opportunity to expound on things more, and you don't have to play the clock game like, oh my gosh, we've only got 5 minutes left and I've got 30 more things to cover, so it's easier for time management.
Right.
So that's part of it. And then, once you're in the room, like you said, that morning meeting, once you're in the room, I try to get there early so that I can meet people and talk to them.
Right.
And I can, exchange, some pleasantries. I can, learn something about somebody. And inevitably, that's something that I can use during the session. So I can say, hey, Larry, we were talking about blah, 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 whatever it was earlier. You're like, yeah. And that helps to get people engaged because they see that you've spoken to somebody that's in the audience. So that makes you more closely related to being one of them than the person up on the stage, and that allows them to be more comfortable with you.
I see.
So that's just something, and that's more of a comfort zone thing for me, that I want to know something about the people that I'm on stage with. I'll share with you my very first presentation at IAPA. I thought was terrible, and part of it was, number one, that I was up on the stage and I was behind the podium, and I didn't realize how much I really fed off the audience. And since then, I'm always down in the audience. I'm walking around. I'm making eye contact with people. So that's part of it. But then I also, before the presentation, I was up on the stage. I was looking through my notes. I didn't, go introduce myself to anybody. I didn't talk to anybody. So it was a very cold, in my opinion, presentation that very first time. Yeah. So I learned from those things, like, I know I can do this better, but I put all these roadblocks in front of me, like not introducing myself to people and staying up on the stage. So since then, I'm always down on the floor or moving around, maybe on the stage part of it, down on the floor sometimes. And that helps me stay more engaged with the people that are there.
Right. And that goes back to what we talked about before about networking and all those other things. Like, that was another way of getting over it, to gain the confidence that you now have in order to do these things. So it's interesting how it all flowed into one.
It kind of did. And I think the confidence piece, you talk about what can we learn from that, what can we apply to that. I think that's so important for leaders to have confidence in what they're doing.
Yes.
And by you talking to them about the fact that it's okay to fail, right? And mentoring them and teaching them and helping them learn how to make decisions, I think, are great ways to build people's confidence. And I love what you say about you're not just trying to create robots. You don't want just minions out there doing your work. You want people out there to make decisions, because that's what leaders do. So all those things help to build the confidence, and it's not something that happens overnight. It takes a long time.
It takes years, at least in some instances for me. It takes years. It takes 2 years to build a culture or change a culture, in my opinion. So I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. And that, you speak about culture. That's if you know where you're going with the culture, right? That's if you have everybody on board.
You got to have the right people, and you got to have the right direction. There's a whole lot of components there.
That's right. It's not just about Larry sitting in his office going, I'm going to change the culture this year, right?
I wish it was that easy.
Right?
No, we have a 90-10 rule. So 90% in the summer, 90% of our managers are required to be in the park leading by example. And obviously the other 10% behind the scenes doing what they got to do. So, that's how we found a way to try to keep that culture rolling, especially when we get to what you talk about in your book, August-itis, essentially burnout. That's when it all begins. Or, well, in the book it's not, but how you explain it.
That's where you see it, right?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. For sure. Awesome. All right. Well, I could talk about that stuff all day, but I have one more question for you.
Absolutely.
Okay. So it's funny, we talked about this before we started recording officially, but I know that you're a Superman fan.
Yes.
And, every superhero has their weakness. So, Superman's got kryptonite.
Yes.
So, what is Larry's kryptonite, and what do you do to overcome it?
Oof. It's funny you say that because I have my own SWOT analysis that I do on myself consistently.
Okay.
You're your own biggest critic. And if I had to narrow it down to a single answer for you, whew, I guess it would be that I'm too ambitious with certain things. And that might seem like, how does that make sense? The problem is I like to take on more than I know I can handle because I want to prove to myself that I can do it.
Okay.
It doesn't matter what it is. If I didn't know how to build a house, but I needed to build a house, I would go and I would, YouTube it, Google it, do whatever I had to do. I'd build everything, and it might be not 100% correct, but then I would use that process for phase two. So sometimes you get overwhelmed, but that's how I develop the fact that I don't see myself with a lot of stress too often because I dive into a lot of projects at home. And so my fiance would say that's kryptonite because I have the house set up when it's going to be done. Is I have, I'm working on sculpting this, or I'm working on a 3D program with that, or I'm writing my book over here, whatever it is I'm doing. That's how I unplug and that's how I get around everything. But that's too ambitious, and sometimes because now I'm taking on 15 different projects, and they're all in various stages of complete at home. At work,
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit different. At work, I have to get that project done right away, so I'm a little bit more centered. But to answer your question, I think it would be to try to do too much, too ambitious to get things accomplished, and that kind of pushes me back further than I probably want to be. But at the end of the day, it's just time. I'll get to it tomorrow if I don't get to it today. At least at home. At work, that's a little bit different. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And it's interesting, you put it in two different contexts, right? So there's the home where you've got all these different projects, all these irons in the fire, and then at work, recognizing that there's a different responsibility, obviously,
correct.
at work to get things done. And maybe you're, I would never call you not ambitious, but less over ambitious,
Yes.
more realistic at work, maybe.
Realistic. It's probably a better word for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
As I progressed into this role, I found out about myself actually utilizing the DISC psychology exam that you actually provided.
Mm-hmm.
I still have it, and I still retake it year to year. And I found that since the time when you spoke, a few years ago, up until my current role, I was pretty much consistent with my thought process. But then as I evolved into this role, I completely am on the other end of the spectrum now because each manager requires a different me to get things accomplished. So I noticed that my thought processes had changed. And at first I was attributing it to, oh, maybe I'm getting wiser at my age, I'm getting older. But no, what it's coming down to is I'm starting to realize that what worked for me before wasn't necessarily what's going to work for me today.
Mm-hmm.
So now at work, I had to change my whole dynamic to get things accomplished a specific way. But at home, I don't want to make a decision about anything. So I leave it up to the fiance to do that. And that's where that conflict comes from, is because now I don't want to make a decision.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And what great insight. I think if any leader could take something away, what worked for me in the past, maybe as a frontline employee, is probably not going to work for me as a leader, 100%. And then
Yes.
certainly as you move up the ladder, as you are now not only responsible for frontline folks, but you're responsible for other leaders as well. So
Right.
that's a whole new set of skills that you've had to develop.
And it's funny you say that because my former boss, John Bigu, had given me a book at one point, an audio book, and I hope I don't say the wrong name, but let me see if I can say, "What got you here won't get you there."
Okay.
And he gave it to me, and he says, you should really pay attention to what this thing says. And the whole concept of that book is exactly what you just hit upon: was the set of skills that you have today made you successful, but in order to get where you want to go tomorrow, you might need a new set of skills you never even knew you had to develop.
Right.
And that's what I found out over this past year was, wow, okay, hard work works off to a certain degree, but now I have to think of processes differently, and it's a whole new set of skills.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So did I hear in there too that you're writing a book, or was that just an example?
No, I am. I
cool.
am. I've been in the process of writing this thing for 5 years. It's a nonfiction book, and essentially, I'm a movie buff. We talked before. I like superheroes, and people watching are like, "Wow, this guy likes a lot of weird things." Yeah, that's me. That's my personality. But I've always wanted to do it, and it's on my bucket list, and I just can't figure out the ending. So that's why I'm kind of stuck. I think that I should have wrote the ending first and went back, but now I know if I ever write phase 2, what to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
see, this is your first attempt in learning.
Exactly
Right?
my point. See, there's a good example of it.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, when that book comes out, you let me know. I'll buy the first copy.
Oh, absolutely. I'll just it's
Exciting. Exciting.
Sure.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions, right? That was 3 and 3. So
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Larry, thank you so much for your time. This has been awesome, and
Yeah.
really appreciate all of your great questions and your insight. And hope we can catch up again soon.
I absolutely. Thank you for your time, Matt. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Take care.